All right, good morning. I realized that I forgot to introduce myself when I came out the first time. My name is Nate. I am the student ministry pastor. So excited to be here with you all this morning. For those who know me, they know that one thing about me is I am really opinionated, and I love debating with people. You know, some people do not. They're like, you're just arguing, and you're so angry all the time when you're debating. I'm like, no, I'm not angry. I just love it. I love getting to talk to people and tell them about my opinion. I love getting to hear, and listen to them kind of tell me their opinion just so I can come and tell them that they're wrong. It's just really exciting. So I love that. And, sometimes I'm right. Sometimes in my conversations, I'm like, yeah, I was right on this one. But sometimes, rarely, of course, I'm wrong. And that being said, though, there are some moments in my life where I remember that I was, so wrong about something that I was like, I got to, go on the opposite end and advocate for this thing because I was so wrong about it that I just really need to make sure people know about this thing. And one thing came to mind this week as I was getting ready for this message. I remember growing up, in my teens especially, when there was a certain restaurant that when the conversation of, the greatest came up, it always came up. And so when I would say, I've never had it before, they would be like, what? I can't believe you've never had it. Which then made me like, okay, relax. It can't be that good, I thought. There's just no way this restaurant is that good. It has to be overrated. There's no possible way. In fact, when my wife and I were dating, she brought me back something from this place, and it was cold. And so when I tried it, I was like, it just, elevated my stance that this place is super overrated. Well, when we were married now at 22, I remember we were traveling to right outside of Las Vegas. Lauren had some family out there, and so we flew out, and we had some time before going to the house. And so Lauren's like, why don't you try it? Try it now. Try it hot. And so I thought, okay, fine. I'll do it just to say that I have officially done it. So we pull in the drive-thru, and we ordered. Lauren ordered for me because she told me this is what I need to order. And so I remember getting it, and I took a bite, and oh my goodness, I was so wrong. Because that number 2 animal style was, in fact, exactly as good as everyone says. And so I have to say that I was wrong. In-N-Out is, in fact, the greatest fast food burger in America. It's just, and you can have a different opinion, but your opinion's wrong. Because it is, in fact, it's just the best. And so I tell anybody I can, because that experience, I was like, I thought I'd had burgers up to 22 years old, and then I realized I didn't have a good burger until I had In-N-Out. It, elevated my status of burgers. And so anytime, students know I love In-N-Out. If we're going to meet together, I'll find any opportunity to be like, let's just drive up to In-N-Out. Why not? It's kind of close, so we'll drive up there. I've never had a bite of In-N-Out and been like, well, this is okay. Every single time. I could have a day after day. In fact, I love it so much, sometimes I wear T-shirts. You may have seen them on some mid-service videos before. I like to rep the In-N-Out. And it's ultimately because as weird as it is, there's this sense where, I remember that time where I'd never had In-N-Out, and I was like, it's not that good. So now every time someone comes here and they've never had it, I'm like, let's go to In-N-Out, because I need to share with you the joy that I have every time I take a bite of that burger. You need to experience that joy because I like you, and I want you to experience that joy as well because I want to share that. And so for some of us, right, we all have that one thing. I kind of want you to think about this really quickly. What is the thing that brings you so much joy that you can't help but share it with other people? When you think about this thing, you're just like, I can't help but tell other people about how awesome this thing is. Maybe it's a diet or a gym routine or a deal at Safeway or whatever, right? You're like, this is awesome, and you got to text your friends about it. Whatever it is, you've got something that you're super, super passionate about, and you got to tell people about it. Well, the Bible has a very similar sense. In fact, the book of Acts, which we've been going through, Luke writes this book, and he basically says there's something that people once thought was wrong, and then when they realized it was right, they had to tell everybody about it. Except that thing, of course, is way more important than just an In-N-Out burger. This is something of eternal value. And one of the key focuses in that story is a guy by the name of Paul. And Paul, he was, like me at one point, thought that he was super right about something. Although unlike me, he thought he was so right about something that he was persecuting, arresting, potentially in outside ways killing people who thought that they were right. And Paul was so sure they were wrong that he was doing all these things. But then Paul has this encounter where all of a sudden what he thought was right, he realizes he was so wrong about, and he can't help now but then tell every single person he can about this enlightenment that he received. And this is how the book of Acts kind of goes. And Paul is so zealous for this thing to tell people about this that we heard last week from Pastor Rick that the religious leaders of the time, they start to get annoyed by it. And so about 23 years after Paul has this enlightenment experience to telling people about what he's discovered, Paul he's arrested, and then they're trying to kill him. They say, like, the religious leaders are like, we're not going to do anything until Paul is dead. So Paul, he gets transferred to Caesarea, and then today we're going to be in Acts 26. Pastor Rick was in 23. So let me give you like a quick kind of update of what happens between these two chapters. So in about Acts 24, there's about AD 57, okay? So Paul's conversion is about AD 34 to 37-ish, so it's been about 23 years here. Paul's taken to Caesarea, and he presents his case before Governor Felix. Well, Felix doesn't have any, he doesn't have any problem either, yes or no, but he hopes that Paul, if he keeps Paul's going to give him money to be released, so he keeps Paul for about 2 years. So then in AD 59, now Acts 25, Festus then replaces Felix, and Festus hears Paul's case. Well, Festus is like, we don't need to be here, let's go to Jerusalem. This sounds like a Jerusalem problem, to which Paul realizes, that's not good for me, they're not going to hear my case, and so he invokes his right as a Roman citizen to appeal to Caesar. Well, Festus then is like, well, what am I supposed to, I don't know what I'm supposed to tell Caesar that I'm even bringing you there for. And so King Herod Agrippa ends up showing up. And so he tells King Herod Agrippa, he's like, let me tell you this case so that you can kind of help me understand what's happening here. He tells King Herod Agrippa, and then Herod Agrippa says, I'll hear Paul's case myself. He at least is curious enough. He's like, why don't I'll hear it. And that takes us to then Acts chapter 26, which is where we're going to find ourselves and we're going to park at today. So in verse 1, here's what we see. Now Agrippa said to Paul, you are permitted to speak for yourself. Then Paul extended his hand and proceeded to make his defense. Now Paul is going to lay out this is the reason why we skipped the last two is because Paul gives kind of a small kind of preview of what he's basically going to lay out in full here in chapter 26, which is how he went from somebody who was here, had an experience, and to now why he does what he does. And so this is what he's going to lay out here for King Herod Agrippa in Acts 26. Verses 2 through 3. Paul says, regarding all the things of which I am accused by the Jews, King Agrippa, I consider myself fortunate that I'm about to make my defense before you today, especially because you are an expert in all customs and questions among the Jews. Therefore, I beg you to listen to me patiently. Now, what we note is that, first off, this is like, we might read over this, but Paul's basically been like stuck in a sense. Now, he's had some freedoms the last 2 years, but for lack of a better word, he's basically been lightly imprisoned for the last 2 years. He finally gets to present his case before somebody, and he considers himself fortunate. Now, I don't know about you, but I don't think most of us would consider ourselves fortunate. We'd probably consider ourselves annoyed, angry, like 2 years later, really? Like, here I am again, but Paul says he's fortunate, happy, he's blessed, he's excited to be able to present his case before Agrippa. Why? Well, because King Agrippa is an expert in all customs and then questions amongst the Jews. And so here's kind of where Paul goes, is he sees this opportunity where he's like, I see someone who was where I was. He believes what I believed. I know you because I was you. And now Paul's like, I feel blessed because I'm going to have this chance to then share how I went from where you are to where I am now in hopes that you will see what I saw. With this in mind, then, Paul is going to start from the beginning. He's going to start from like before he has in this encounter with Jesus on the road to Damascus, which we'll get to. He's going to start kind of like, here's who I was in the beginning. So then, verse 4, all Jews, Paul says, know my way of life since my youth, which from the beginning was spent among my own nation and in Jerusalem, since they have known about me for a long time, if they're willing to testify, that I lived as a Pharisee according to the strictest sect of our religion. Now, Paul, in other words, he's kind of like building rapport here, right? He's like, I understand you. The only other way that I like feel like I could kind of try to describe this is, so I've never been in the military, and if I were to like go to an army base out abroad and be like, let me tell you guys about what war looks like, they would laugh at me because I've never experienced that in my life. right? That would be very different than if somebody who was like a general or something showed up and was like, let me tell you about my experience. Let me tell you what you should be doing. People would listen, right? Because there's some experience there. There's a camaraderie. There's a brotherhood. There's all this stuff that happens in that aspect of things. If I were to show up, it's like, I might still be right about some things, but it doesn't matter because it's coming from the wrong person. So Paul, what he's doing is he's like, look, like he's going to build rapport because he's like, I know who you are. In fact, I followed everything that you followed, and I didn't just follow it casually. I was like one of the most important people when it comes to the Jewish religion. I followed it strictly. I was a Pharisee. I was an up-and-comer. In fact, if we go to Philippians chapter 3, Paul describes himself in this way. He says, if anyone else thinks he is confident in the flesh, I have more reason. And then he starts to kind of list those reasons for why he should be confident in the flesh. He was circumcised the 8th day, of the nation of Israel, of the tribe of Benjamin, a Hebrew of Hebrews. As to the law, a Pharisee. As to zeal, a persecutor of the church. Just like the Christian church, he's like, I was so zealous about my faith that I persecuted people who blasphemed what I felt like the actual God's word, right? So he's like, I was a persecutor of this church. And as to righteousness, which is in the law, found blameless. Now, of course, Paul's going to go on to say that this is all rubbish compared to knowing Christ, but he's building this case of like, look, I don't just understand you. In fact, I was like the best of the best. If anybody could have kept doing it the way that it was being done, it would have been me because I was doing it as good as I possibly could. I was like the elite. I was a Pharisee. I was going to be really, really important. I was an up-and-coming prodigy. Like, they were really excited about me. I was general status. Like, Paul's kind of building himself up here, and he's like, this is who I was. Now, in verse 6, he says, but now, kind of, I'm standing trial for the hope of the promise made by God to our fathers. The promise to which our 12 tribes hope to attain, and they earnestly serve God night and day. For this hope, O King Agrippa, I am being accused by the Jew. And so Paul's basically like, I followed this way, I did what I was supposed to do, and now I'm being arrested because I believe in the hope that you also believe. It's just that I believe that already happened, basically. And now I'm standing on trial for the same hope that you are here believing yourself. And then he kind of asks this question in verse 8. It's really, really important. Why is it considered incredible among you, and this you is like a plural you, so it'd be like a you all or a y'all, that God raises the dead? Now, this is kind of the sticking point, isn't it? Like, it's not just the sticking point for the Jewish listeners, it's also the sticking point for culture, right? Pastor Fred says all the time, if Jesus rose from the dead, it changes everything. And that's totally 100% true. Because I'll have conversations even with people sometimes where they're like, yeah, I believe in some sort of higher power that probably created the world. Now, we say it's God, right? God from the Bible here. But they would say, I believe in some sort of higher power that created the earth. However, the resurrection is where they draw the line. Which is interesting to me, because I would think if God, I believe obviously God of the Bible, but if God created the world, why is it all of a sudden crazy that that same God who created the world could raise somebody from the dead? Why could that God who not created the world do whatever he wanted within the scope of his creation? And Paul, talking to these Jewish believers, he's like, look, not believers, Jewish people, he's like, you know that he's omnipotent, omnipresent, omniscient. You believe all these things about the one true God, and yet for some reason, you find it hard to believe that this same God who can do whatever he wants could raise somebody from the dead. And now what Paul's actually doing is it seems, because it feels kind of random if you like read it in its entirety, it feels like he's kind of just planting a seed a little bit. Because then he's going to go back to what he was already talking about, his past before Jesus. But he kind of plants the seed, and then he's going to water it a little bit. And he's like, I'm just going to kind of leave this here. And then, like, hopefully they'll think on that as he comes back to what he's doing. But this is an incredibly important question, is it not? Like, if Jesus rose from the dead, then it does change literally everything. Paul knows this because he's experienced the risen Jesus. Now, what he's going to do is he's going to kind of step back, and he's going to talk about what he who he was. He says, I was a Pharisee, I was really important, but not just that. I, in fact, hated Christians so much that I was out persecuting them. I was spending my free time arresting them, trying to get them to confess and blaspheme God. I was spending my time to go to different cities to get as many as I could, because Paul's goal was to eradicate Christianity completely. Because he was so sure that there was no possible way that this could have happened, that he was like, I was on a mission to kill all of them. In fact, in Acts 7:58, we read this account. In the stoning of Stephen, the very first Christian martyr, Stephen proclaims Jesus. He talks all about it. And then you read here in verse 58, when they had driven Stephen out of the city, they began stoning him. And the witnesses laid aside their cloaks at the feet of a young man named Saul. Now, Saul would eventually become Paul. This is the same Saul and Paul, the same person. And so what you see here is not only is like Saul a part of this, he was, like in some ways, the linchpin. He was excited about it. He would say in Acts 26 that he cast his vote against the death penalty. So people would be like put on for death, and they would say guilty of death. Paul would like applaud. He would smile. He was excited about it. This is who Paul was, he talks about. He says he hated Christians. He wanted to eradicate them at all cost. But then, verse 12, while so engaged in this lifestyle, while so engaged in going out and trying to persecute and kill as many Christians as possible, on this mission, as I was journeying to Damascus, with the authority and commission of the chief priests. So again, Paul's like, not only was I like doing this because I felt zealous to do it, but the chief priests and the higher-ups, they were excited about it. They were commissioning me to go do it. They thought this was a great idea. And so Paul, on the way to do this, it says, at midday, O king, I saw on the way a light from heaven brighter than the sun. I don't know if you've thought about that. If you've gone out and looked at the sun, don't do that. But you all know how bright the sun is. And Paul's like, I had this experience where not just I wasn't just looking at the sun, but everywhere around me was the sun, except it was brighter than the sun. So that's pretty bright. So we had this spectacular experience. It was shining around me and those who were journeying with me. Then it continues, verse 14. And when we had all fallen to the ground, I heard a voice saying to me in the Hebrew dialect, Saul, Saul, why are you persecuting me? It is hard for you to kick against the goads. And I said, who are you, Lord? And the Lord said, I am Jesus, whom you are persecuting. See, this is the Acts 9 experience. If you were to go back and read Acts 9, you can see that Paul, on his way to persecute Christians, on his way to kill Christians, has this experience that then takes him from somebody who wanted to kill Christians to the greatest Christian missionary in history. Absolutely miraculous. Insane. And he's like, I went from this guy, but I had this experience that changed everything about me. And we get this kind of new detail here. Paul adds a couple details for us, which is cool about this experience. One of those is he says, it is hard for you to kick against the goads, Jesus says to him, which is not a typo. A goad is like a prod for ox. So this is kind of like, generally speaking, what it might have looked like. This is a drawing, obviously. That was a joke, all right? It's fine. So at the end of that is a point, right? And so the goal for this person was they would prod the ox to keep the ox on course. That was the goal, to keep the ox going the way that they wanted them to go. And so Jesus says to Paul, he's like, Paul, is it hard for you to resist the way you're supposed to be going? Is it hard for you to kick against the goad? Isn't it a little painful, right, for you to kick against the goad? Paul, I've been trying to point you the way you're supposed to go. Has it been difficult for you to resist that? Has it been hard for you to go the wrong way? Has it been painful for you, Paul? Stop resisting the way that I am trying to have you go. And the thing is, Paul's not the last person to have ever done this. In fact, there are many today still kicking against the goads. Have you ever had a conversation with somebody, like they're telling you their life story, like they're like, this thing happened, and this thing happened, and this thing, and you're like listening, and you're like, wow, God's fingerprints are all over this story. And they get to the end and they're like, and by coincidence and chance, I'm still here today. And you're like, wait a minute. Like, what are you talking about? Like, it's so clear, like miracle after miracle after miracle. Like, I've known people where like they're telling me their story, and then like you're like, Okay, so like, but God somehow, like, this is all a chance. Like, this chance just keep continually happen. It's like God's trying to direct them and protect them. And it's like so obvious that God's doing these things for them, but they're kicking against the goads. They're resisting the way that they're supposed to go. Whatever reason that might be. People have all sorts of different reasons for why they might resist the way that God is trying to point them, which, to be clear, God is always pointing them to himself, to Jesus. And so this is always the direction that they're trying to go. But for whatever reason, people resist it. But it's important for us to know about a goad is that, like, a goad can't necessarily force the ox to go any certain direction. It's just going to direct it that way. If the ox really wanted to, it could go whatever way it wanted. It might be painful, it might be frustrating, but an ox could go whatever way it wants to go. The goad is just to keep it going and direct it the right way. And in the same way, we want to be clear that God doesn't force people to believe in Jesus as Savior. However, he does direct people. See, in other words, God's going to give people a path. He's going to say, go this way. This is the way you should be going. This is the way I'm directing you. This is the way that's going to lead to life. But some people, for whatever reason, they want to keep going the other way. Like, they're like, no, I think I'm going to keep trying this way. Even though this way's leading to pain, this way's not leading to life, I don't like where it's going. If I just keep going farther, maybe I'm finally going to experience what I think I'm going to experience. And God's just like, wait a minute, but like, God's trying. But he's not going to force them. Now, some people will recognize that, and they'll be like, man, maybe God's been really clear with me for a long time, and I've been resisting. But some, they're going to resist it. They're going to kick against it. They're going to fight it. And Paul's going to talk about how he was this man. He was resisting what God had for Paul. He was like, God had this great plan, and Paul was kicking against the goads. So finally, Paul has this experience. And he changes, right? He's like, I once was here, but this experience was so groundbreaking, so earth-shaking for me that I could do nothing but go the other way and do exactly what Jesus asked him to do. And what Jesus asked him to do is to go tell everybody about him. And Paul does. That's what Paul does. And so Paul goes out and he starts telling everybody about Jesus, as many people as he possibly can. He's going to, by the time from Acts 9's experience to whenever Paul most likely dies, he goes about 3 decades doing exactly what Jesus calls him to do, because Paul recognizes, I've discovered something, God has shown me something so incredibly exciting, I can do nothing but share it with everybody else. He zealously goes and preaches about Jesus, and he starts telling this to King Agrippa. He starts saying, this is how my experience changed me. But there's a heckler in the crowd. See, in verse 24, while Paul was stating these things in his defense, Festus said in a loud voice, Paul, you are out of your mind. Your great learning is driving you insane. You guys ever heard that before? You guys ever heard that about Christianity? Like, there's no way you can possibly believe this. This is crazy. This is foolish. What you're believing is insane. What you think you know, what you're telling other people, it's crazy. But notice what Paul responds with, because we can be tempted to be angry, by the way. Like when you hear this and you're like, we get tempted to want to like bark back at them. No, you're the fool. You're crazy. But this is not what Paul does. But Paul said in verse 25, I am not insane, most excellent Festus. Now, notice, by the way, he still addresses Festus with respect, right? He's not like, I'm not insane, you crazy moron, or anything like that. Like, he's still respectful, which is really important, by the way, because sometimes when we get frustrated like that, we can be tempted to like say something mean. He still addresses Festus with respect. On the contrary, I'm speaking out with truthful and rational words. For the king knows about these matters, and I also speak to him with confidence, since I'm persuaded that none of these things escape his notice, for this has not been done in a corner. This has not been done in secret, Paul basically says. And I want to kind of take a quick moment to note that there are 2 listeners in this conversation for Paul. One of the listeners is Festus. Festus is belligerent. He's uninterested. He goes out of his way to try to belittle Paul, right? I can just picture like Paul's making his defense, and do you know when people like jump up and they want to make somebody look foolish, they always want to make sure other people are like with them as well? Oh, Paul, you're such a fool. And he's like looking to see if anybody else is going to agree with him and kind of like, because he wants to look good. He wants to look smart. Festus has no part to play in any of this. This has no effect on Festus at all. He's a Roman. He's not a Jewish citizen who Paul's addressing. He goes out of his way to try to embarrass Paul. But the second person is Agrippa. And Agrippa, for whatever reason, right, notice that Paul does address Festus, but then he like diverts his attention back to who he was actually talking to, which was Herod Agrippa. Herod Agrippa seems, at least from here, like he's a little bit curious, like he's listening. And Paul's like, look, I hear you, Festus, I heard what you said, and I'm going to address it, but I'm going to get back to the person who's actually curious. See, there are usually two types of unbelievers we might encounter when we talk with them. There's the closed, and there's the curious. The closed is the person where you have a conversation with them over and over and over again, and they just don't seem to want to do anything but argue with you about it. They don't ask questions. They start to make fun of you maybe. They start to bash you for it. For whatever reason, they're completely uninterested. The curious, however, are people who, like, they are asking questions. You can kind of tell when you're talking with somebody if they seem to be focusing. They ask questions about it, and maybe even, like, you talk about something and you answer a question, you're like, okay, they're getting close. And maybe they come back and they ask again, you're like, dang it, like, I thought I had it. But they're still asking. They're curious. They want to know. These are people who are like the Agrippa, right? They're like, they seem to be focusing enough for us to continue making our point. And there are going to be those two types of people for the most part. And we need to focus on the curious, not the closed. For us, we have a limited time. I don't need to tell you guys this. We all know at some point life is going to end. We don't know how long it's going to be, but at some point life is going to end. So time is valuable. And so with the time we have, if we're going to tell people about Jesus, we want to focus on the people who are curious, not the people who are closed. For example, I've had conversations with somebody before where like I've presented the evidence and I've talked about the resurrection, and at the end of the conversation they're like, even if you had all the evidence in the world and it was clear as day, I still wouldn't believe it. What am I doing talking then? Like, am I gonna convince them of something they're not even willing to listen to? I could talk with them till I'm blue in the face, and I could keep trying to talk with them and be like, well, but wait a minute, there is evidence for the resurrection. Wait a minute, there is evidence for the creation. Wait a minute, there is evidence. And they're just like, but even if you have that, I'm not going to believe it. They're closed. But there's people who are curious, people who are asking questions. And if I can spend time with those people are interested. Those people I'm going to talk to. And Paul does the same thing, right? Paul's already presented his case before Festus in Acts 25. So he's presenting it again now. Festus is there and Agrippa's there. And he's like, Festus, I've already presented it before you. If you were going to listen, you would have listened already. So I'm now going to divert my attention to somebody who might be curious. Don't waste your time with people who just want to waste yours. That's all they want to do. It's a lot of people, they just want to belittle you, they want to make fun of you, and they want to waste your time. And they're not worth it. Your job is to tell people and then leave it there. Paul recognizes, I told you, Festus, you've heard the same thing. You know what I've already said. And you can choose to believe it or not. See, there's going to be people in this world who are not going to be worth our time. And I know it's hard for us because sometimes we want to take that upon ourselves and like, but maybe I can change them. Maybe I can do it. Maybe if I just keep pushing and pushing and pushing. And the reality is it's not your job. Your job is to tell them. Beyond that, it's out of your control. And it's not worth telling somebody over and over and over again who doesn't seem interested. Now, we don't know what happens after this. There's two different kind of translations of how King Agrippa responds to this, whether he's actually curious or not, or whether or not he kind of ends this sarcastically. It's kind of tough to know. But in verse 29, Paul concludes his speech, and Paul said, I would wish to God that even in a short or long time, not only you, King Agrippa, but also all who hear me this day would become such as I myself am, except for these chains. Paul knows he's got something so valuable. And he's like, my job is I would hope that everybody would hear this. And they would be enlightened as I myself was. Christians, do you know that you have some of the most important information of all of human history? You have been told the most important thing you could have ever known, ever. And I talked about how, like, in the beginning, like, I love In-N-Out, and I love telling people about In-N-Out. And you might have that thing. I hope you, thought, in your mind, when you thought about that question, you were like, what's that thing that I think about? And we all are really good about being like, hey, let me tell you about this great thing that I've discovered that has no bearings on anybody's eternal salvation or destiny. But for some reason, when it comes to Jesus, when it comes to telling people about the actual most important thing in the world, we hold back a little bit. Why is that? See, in the 1800s, there was a large group of wealthy individuals who bought this retreat town in the mountains of western Pennsylvania. On this lake that they bought, there was a dam. I don't know if this is actually an artist rendition or whatever, but the dam is in theory right over there. And so they bought this, and the dam was kind of older, and so instead of fixing it, though, they started to patch it up. They just decided we're going to patch it up. Well, on May 31st of 1889, a storm hit the towns below it of South Fork and Johnstown. And the storm brought heavy rains, and the dam started to rise. So the people then tried to fix it. They tried to divert the water. They tried to fix the dam, but they realized it was too late, and there was a potential that this dam might break. So they got a guy named John Park, and they said, get on horseback, go down to the town, and tell them that the dam is going to break and they need to evacuate. So John Park got on his horse, and he rode down, and he sent not one but two different messages to be transmitted to South Fork and Johnstown. But for some reason, the officials never communicated them. So, at about 3:10 p.m., the dam finally gave way. Its contents, about 20 million tons of lake water, started rushing down the river towards the towns. Now, South Fork, they heard it coming, they heard the dam break, and a lot of the people were able to run up to the hills, and only about 4 died in South Fork. However, the town of Johnstown were not so lucky, because at this time, the water was moving about 40 miles per hour, about 60 feet tall, and it smashed into Johnstown, killing about 2,209 people. Did you know, Christians, that you have incredibly important, life-saving information, and all you have to do is tell people? When they went back and they asked at the time, why didn't the people transmit the message to those who could have communicated it to the city and evacuated the towns? And when they asked, the people basically said, well, there's been a few false alarms in history, and so we didn't want to make people leave if it wasn't going to actually happen, and we didn't feel like it was that urgent. Ultimately, they just didn't want to look like fools. They felt like, what if I communicate this and people leave and nothing actually happens? Then we're going to look silly. Then we're going to look like fools. Yeah, it might break someday, but it may not be today. But if they would have just communicated it down to the town, something around 2,213 people would have been saved that day. And it can be really frustrating to hear something like that, but I also wonder to myself, how many people who were living in South Fork and Johnstown knew about eternal saving information and never told their neighbors about it? We have the most important information of all time, and our own fears must never outweigh the urgency of our message. Our own fears, whether that's to look foolish, whether to lose a friendship or a relationship or whatever, our own fear of what other people might think can never outweigh the urgency of the message. We don't know how long anybody has. Nobody's guaranteed tomorrow. We all have pictured in our minds of how long we're probably going to last and how our life's going to go. And it might end up looking like we might live as long as we hoped we would, but some people won't. And if you think you have an idea of how long it's going to be, you're naive. You don't have that power. Paul does not have this kind of fear. You notice that one, he's excited to present his case before Agrippa. You remember how it seems weird that somebody who's in chains for 2 years is like, I'm so stoked to get to tell you this. But that's because Paul knew that whatever God called on him, whenever God asked Paul to do what he was supposed to do, Paul was excited because whenever God presented him an opportunity to tell people about Jesus, Paul was excited to do it because it was important. When somebody went and tried to ridicule Paul and make him seem like a fool, he didn't lash back because Paul knew he had the truth. He spoke out with truthful and rational words. He had nothing to be angry about. He communicated exactly what he's supposed to do. And if Festus wanted to belittle him for it, that's fine. Paul's job was to tell the truth. Paul's job was to do what Jesus asked him to do. It might cost you your public image. It might cost you a friendship. It might cost you a relationship. It might cost you that community with the people who are at your work. Are you letting your fears hold you back from communicating what you're supposed to be communicating? You know, if you say like, well, I just don't want to tell my friend yet because I don't want to lose the friendship, then you're not a good friend. If you say you love somebody and you're not going to tell them about Jesus because, well, like, I just want to make sure it's organic. I want to make sure it's natural. You don't love them. Because hundreds of thousands of people have said that same thing and that person was not there to be seen again. You think you have the next time, but you may not. And if you really love them, if you really care about them, you will tell them about the most important thing that you could ever tell them about. Who cares what the greatest hamburger in America is? Tell them about Jesus. What was Paul's goal, right? At the end, we'll read it again. I would wish to God that even in a short or long time, at any amount of time, Paul says, I would wish to God that you, all who hear me this day, would become such as I myself am. That all of you who hear me this day would be able to experience the joy and the life that I found when Jesus appeared to me that day. I am telling you something that I experienced personally, Paul says. And I hope nothing more than that everybody who hears me would believe it. You know, I want to be clear. If you haven't believed in Jesus this morning, if you're sitting here, I'm so glad you're here. But the dam is breaking. Danger's coming. Whether you believe it or not, it is up to you. But ultimately, danger's coming. And what I want you to know is that that we have an opportunity, and I'm going to do it right now because I want you to know that I refuse to not tell you that there is hope. See, God sent his son, Jesus. He is the Son of God. He came to this earth, and he lived a sinless life, and he had a mission to save people, not from like oppression or their hard life or whatever other people like to think he did or does, but to save us from ourselves, to save us from our own sinful nature, that when we choose to sin against God, we distance ourselves and we put ourselves eternally, forever separated from a relationship with him. And Jesus came to change that. He came and he lived a sinless life. He claimed to be the Messiah, the Son of God. And he died on a Roman cross. And just when all the people, the religious leaders at the time thought, yes, it's over, we win, all this Messiah nonsense will stop, he was dead on a Friday, he was seen again on a Sunday. By hundreds of people. And then the person who disbelieved it potentially the most, the greatest persecutor of the Christian church for the early time, then had an encounter with the risen Jesus that was so remarkable that he completely flipped the script. This is what Jesus can do. Jesus tells Paul in Acts 26, we didn't read this yet, 17b through 18. He tells Paul, I'm sending you, Paul, to open their eyes so that they may turn from darkness to light and from the power of Satan to God, that they may receive forgiveness of sins and an inheritance among those who have been sanctified, made clean by faith in Jesus. There's one way you can be saved. and the message is being communicated. It's by belief in Jesus. John 3:16-17, one of the most wonderful verses, I think, in the Bible. It says, "For God so loved the world that he gave his only Son, so that everyone who believes in him will not perish but have eternal life. For God did not send the Son into the world to judge the world, but so that the world might be saved through him." If you will believe that, you are saved. You are called a child of God. You have an inheritance in heaven forever. You will be now not eternally separated from God for eternity, but you are forever his. You're a Christian. Will you believe that today? Will you believe in the message that we are saying that there is safety, there is hope that is being communicated? Will you believe it? I want to close with this. Christians, you have the most important information of all time. I keep saying it, but I want you to recognize it. The info you have, what you have been told, sometimes we can overthink it and we're like, well, but like, do I fully understand? Your goal is not to make everyone a theologian. It's to tell people about the joy and the life that you have received by belief in Jesus. That's your job. You have something that everybody needs. And we sit here and we're worried about telling other people about our political views or our favorite sports team or whatever else, and we're wasting our time because we're not telling them about the most important information we have. That there is danger coming and they could be saved through belief in Jesus. We cannot let our fears keep us from telling people about what's most important. Because the life-changing message of Jesus is far too exciting to keep to ourselves. It's exciting. Yeah, there's danger, but it's exciting. There's something exciting we can tell people. Paul experienced this. Paul's like, I thought life was good. I thought I was doing everything I can, but it's all rubbish because Jesus paid it for me, and I got to tell everybody about it. It's exciting. It's a call to live on mission, to stop making excuses, to go and tell the world about Jesus because the world desperately needs it. Are you going to tell people about Jesus? Let me pray for us. God, we thank you that you sent Jesus. God, we thank you that through belief in him we can have eternal life. That is the greatest news we could ever possibly even comprehend. God, the wonder of this news is undefinable. God, forgive me for the times where I have not seized an opportunity to tell people about the joy that I have found in Jesus. God, I pray that you would make it clear for all of us when those moments come up, that you would kind of give us a nudge, that we would know that this is the time. And God, if we're afraid to tell people, God, I pray that you give us courage. Because, God, you just want us to tell people. Thank you for the truth of these words in the Bible, that we can read through Acts and see how you have changed people and that you can change us as well. Thank you, God, for your love. Thank you for your great grace. In your Son's name, amen. All right, everyone.